Okay, that's good. Oh. Okay, we start with the homage to the Buddha. Namo, excuse me. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning, everybody. Yeah, I think everybody must already know about the terrible tragedy that took place yesterday morning in Newtown, Connecticut, where it seems a deranged young man went into a school, an elementary school, and just shot into the classroom and killed altogether 20, the latest I heard was 26 people, 18 students between the ages of 5 and 10, and 8 members of the administration. So I think maybe first, just even though every day hundreds of children around the world die, but this was very close to our monastery. It's just beyond Danbury. And so maybe just in a kind of act of commemoration, we just observe 1 minute of silence and just think of the parents of those children, their brothers and sisters, their classmates, the other teachers and members of the school, and just think of them with compassion. Okay. And it's not enough just to think about the children who died and about the surviving relatives, to think with compassion. But really what's been going on in this country it's been going on for years, but it's been especially increasing over the past year. It's really shameful and pitiful. And what we have to do every time this happens, always it's the right wing and the National Rifle Association comes out and says, it's not guns that kill people, it's people that kills people. It's people with guns that kill people. And guns are just so readily available in this country, anybody can go into a shop who doesn't have a criminal record, hasn't been spent time in a psychiatric clinic and purchase guns. And if you go onto Google and you put homicides in something like global comparisons, you'll see that in all the industrialized countries in the world, the United States is just right up, way, way beyond every other developed country. And then there's a chart that I saw last night, a kind of graph, which shows the relationship between numbers of homicides and strictness or laxity of gun regulations. And you could just, it plots the different countries along that chart, and you could just draw a line across the chart, and we'll show you that those countries that have the strictest gun regulations generally have the lowest homicide rate. And those countries that have the loosest gun regulations have the comparatively higher homicide rates. And the graph goes like this. But the United States, a line drawn through the graph would go like this. But the United States is not even along that line, but it's way up here. And countries like Sweden, Germany, Switzerland, Denmark, Norway, even though Norway had a terrible tragedy, it was about a year and a half ago, but that's just like, an extremely rare incident. Exactly. Yeah. 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 Yes, Claudia. Maybe if you take the microphone then.
As part of our introduction to today's lesson, and certainly for me, one of the reasons why I come to learn more about Buddhism is I also wanted to add the prayer, or whatever word that you prefer, to the young man who was deranged and his parents, and the complete inability in this country to recognize mental illness as well as physical illness. And what I strive for here is, as the daily the words that you had encouraged me to say, the physical, mental, and spiritual well-being.
Yeah. Yeah, and if I read the news correctly, what I understood was that the mother of that young man was a teacher in the school. No, that's not true.
It turns out that it's not true.
Oh, I see. So,
Volunteer work there.
Oh, she does volunteer.
But the principal doesn't do it.
Oh, but did he shoot his mother as well?
Yeah.
Oh, so he killed his mother.
At home.
At home?
Before he was.
Oh, I see. When I'm in California, in Berkeley, I stay in the Berkeley Buddhist Monastery. It's on the corner of McKinley and Bancroft. And right across the street, there's an elementary school. And sometimes when we go out for the walk in the afternoon, we see the children are coming out from school, and then the parents come with their cars to pick up the children. It's so touching that, and it occurs to me, because of the high murder rate in this country, like every time a parent comes to pick up the children from school, it must almost be a relief that day that nothing has happened to the children. When we went to school, it was 1950s elementary school. We just never thought of things like that because we never heard of them. Okay, so anybody else have any comments on this incident? Okay, so let us then continue. Okay, see, we have been... Okay, last week we started the Brahmayu Sutta. That's the discourse with the Brahman Brahmayu. And if you remember in the sutta, the elderly Brahmin, a very old Brahmin, learned Brahmin named Brahmayu, hears a report that this ascetic named Gautama has been wandering around in the Videhan country, and that he's reputed to be a fully enlightened Buddha. And then he instructs his young pupil, Uttara, to go investigate the Buddha to see whether he measures up to certain criteria that the Brahmins have in their scriptures, which describe the characteristics of a Buddha. Amongst these are the 32 physical marks of a great man. And so one who has those 32 marks can be, if he lives the household life, he becomes a universal monarch, a wheel-turning monarch. But if he leaves the household life and becomes a renunciant, then he will become a fully enlightened Buddha who will deliver the message of liberation to the world. So Uttara goes and sees the Buddha. He checks the Buddha's physical characteristics. He sees that he has the 32 marks. Then he follows the Buddha and sort of hangs out with him for 7 months so that he can observe closely his behavior. Then he comes back to his teacher, to his master, and he gives a full report on what he's observed about the Buddha's behavior. And that takes us to page 749. So when the Brahman Brahmayu hears this report about the Buddha's conduct, then he kneels down to the ground, and then he recites 3 times the lines of homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sammasambuddhassa. And then he expresses the hope that sometime in the future he might meet this master Gautama and have some conversation with him. And since Brahmayu is now 120 years old, he has to be hoping that will happen pretty soon because he doesn't have much time left himself. But to his fortune, sometime, just perhaps a little bit after this, the Buddha arrives in Mithila, that is the town where the Brahman is living, and he comes to stay in a particular mango grove. And so then the Brahmin householders of Mithila hear that the Buddha has arrived, and they all decide to go out and to pay homage to him. And the Brahman Brahmayu also hears this report. And he goes, he decides now this is his precious opportunity to see the Buddha. And so he decides to go to the mango grove together with a number of his students. And so when he reaches the mango grove, then he realizes that it's not proper that he should just simply approach the recluse Gautama just like an ordinary person, because he's probably the most distinguished Brahmin in this region. And so he tells one of his students that you should go to the Master Gautama and in my name, speak some polite words to him, asking about his health and so on, and then say that the Brahman Brahmayu, who's old, aged, 120 years old, the master of the Vedas and so on. He has come to this assembly and he wants to see you, he wants to talk to you. Okay, so the Brahmin student delivers the message and the Buddha says, let the Brahmin Brahmayu come up and see me. Okay, so the student reports this to the Brahmin Brahmayu, and the Brahmin Brahmayu goes up to the Blessed One. And as the Brahmin is approaching, everybody in the assembly knows that this is the very distinguished person, so they all make way for him. On the two sides of the assembly, they make way for him so he could pass right through at his ease. Okay, so then the Brahmin Brahmayu comes up to the podium, I guess, and then sits down next to the Buddha. They exchange greetings, and then he himself looks over the Buddha's body, even though he got the report from his student Uttara. But he wants to examine for himself. And so he looks over the Buddha's body, and he sees what is said to be 32 marks of the great man on the Buddha's body, except for 2. He was doubtful about 2 of the marks, and he could not decide about them. So the 2 marks are about the male organ being enclosed in a sheath, and about the largeness, the length of the tongue. If you remember also, one of the 32 marks that I've always been puzzled by is that it said that his taste is extremely acute. I don't know how the Brahmin would observe somebody's faculty of taste. But anyway, then the Brahmin speaks to the Buddha in stanzas. Apparently, very learned Brahmins would have the ability to make up these verses right on the spot. I think it must be one of the arts in which they're trained. So he says, the 2 and 30 marks I learned that are the signs of a great man, I still do not see 2 of these upon your body, Gautama. Is what should be concealed by a cloth, hid in a sheath, O greatest of men, then though called by a word of feminine gender, this is the tongue. The tongue in Pali is, you see, unlike English, but similar to some European languages, Pali nouns have gender, that is masculine, feminine, neuter. And the tongue is, the word for tongue is jivha, with a long A, which marks it as a feminine noun. So he says, though called by a word of feminine gender, perhaps your tongue, the jivha, is a manly one. I guess a large tongue is supposed to be a manly mark. Perhaps your tongue is large as well, according to what we have been taught. Please put it out a little bit, and so, O seer, cure our doubt, for welfare in this very life, and happiness in lives to come. And now we crave for leave to ask something that we aspire to know. Okay, then the Buddha realized that the Brahmin was still puzzled by 2 of the marks. And so first, now he performs a feat of supernormal power such that the Brahmin Brahmayu was able to see that the Buddha's male organ was enclosed in a sheath. So apparently one could say about the Buddha, he wasn't Jewish. So if you've ever seen, there was a famous Samadhi statue in Anuradhapura. You see it, sometimes you see photos of it in some of the famous Buddhist art books. was on the cover of the old edition of, oh yeah, it was on the cover of that old edition of Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha. And I think there was a photo of it in Ananda Kumaraswamy. What was it called? The Buddha and the Gospel of Buddhism, something like that. It had a broken nose. The nose was chipped off. But the nose had been reconstructed a couple of decades ago. And so when I first saw that Samadhi statue, in person, I think it was as far back as 1972. The nose was reconstructed in such a way that when I first saw the statue, I thought, I knew it all along. He's Jewish. It's just that they constructed the nose. It doesn't look like an Indian kind of nose, but it protrudes like my old dentist nose. Okay. Okay, so then he sees, that the Buddha's male organ is enclosed in a sheath, and then the Buddha extends his tongue so that he could touch both of his ear holes and both of the nostrils and cover the whole of his forehead with his tongue. And then the Buddha addresses the Brahmin in verses. He says, the 2 and 30 marks you learned that are the signs of a great man, all on my body can be found, so Brahmin, doubt no more on that. Okay, so at this point, the Buddha has spoken, addressed the Brahmin's concern about what is the mark of a Buddha. So now, at that point, the Buddha is, dealing at the level of the Brahmins, or he's speaking at the Brahmin's level of understanding. But now the Buddha is going to speak from his own level of understanding to tell the Brahmin what it is that really makes one a Buddha. So he says, what must be known, I've directly known. What must be developed, I have developed. What must be abandoned, I have abandoned. Therefore, Brahmin, I am a Buddha. I'll come back to this. But just then concluding, he says, for welfare in this very life and happiness in lives to come, I give you leave, so please ask whatever you aspire to know. Okay, the key to understanding the Buddha's conception of a Buddha is this middle verse. So what must be known, I've directly known. What is it that must be known? What is it that must be developed? What is it that must be abandoned? In fact, these 3 lines are in a sense alluding to a particular teaching of the Buddha. Exactly, it's the 4 Noble Truths. So what must be known that the Buddha has directly known is the Noble Truth of suffering. We could say all 4 Noble Truths together, but particularly we could say the Noble Truth of suffering. And then when you take the essence of the Noble Truth of suffering, what is sort of the core or essence of the truth of suffering? What? The what? No, I didn't say the cause. The essence, sort of the core of the First Noble Truth? Not quite. Well, dukkha is just a Pali word, but in the formula for the First Noble Truth, the Buddha states it very explicitly. What is the essence, what is the core of the Noble Truth of suffering? Dukkha. Just in one phrase. If you remember the First Noble Truth, something that contains within itself all the different aspects of dukkha. No. I heard it from the back. Right, it's the 5 aggregates. So the Buddha has directly known, fully understood the 5 aggregates. If you remember in the first sermon, the first discourse, the Buddha says, this is the noble truth of suffering. This noble truth of suffering must be fully understood. This noble truth of suffering has been fully understood. So to fully understand the noble truth of suffering is to understand the 5 aggregates. And what does it mean to fully understand the 5 aggregates, in essence? To understand? Right, to understand the 5 aggregates in terms of the 3 marks. That first, what are the 5 aggregates? We have to get those down. Right, okay. Material form, feeling, perception, the mental formations or volitional activities, and consciousness. And then all 5 aggregates are marked by the 3 characteristics. They're all impermanent, arising and passing away. They're all sort of unsatisfactory, subject to suffering, and they're all not self, not I, not mine. So that is directly knowing and fully understanding the noble truth of suffering. Then actually, maybe for metrical purposes, the lines are not really in the logical order. So taking the next one that comes logically is what must be abandoned, I have abandoned. So what is it that must be abandoned? Excuse me? Well, there are more precise terms that we have. Say again? Attachment. There's another word that we usually use, is more precise. Clinging, again, it's not as precise. We want like the formula from the Four Noble Truths. Okay, that's good. Craving, and sort of the most specific one is craving. That comes in the Four Noble Truths. But more broadly, we could say all of the mental defilements. But like the 2 sort of roots of samsara, the roots of birth and death, are craving and ignorance. And it's because of craving and ignorance that all the other defilements arise. So the Buddha is one who has abandoned or eliminated all craving, all ignorance, and all the other defilements. And so what must be abandoned, I have abandoned, is referring to the second noble truth. Then we would take what must be developed, I have developed. And what is that referring to? more specifically, right, the Noble Eightfold Path. We could say most broadly, all 37 aids to enlightenment, but in the Four Noble Truths formula, it's the Noble Eightfold Path. And then the one thing that's not mentioned here to fill out the Four Noble Truths, but is sort of implied, is what? I can't hear her. Speak loudly. We have the path already. Husband? Right, exactly. The cessation of suffering. So that is, what is to be done with regard to the cessation of suffering? Let us say that the Buddha was to put an additional line in the verse. What would he say? One word? What must be? It's not exactly enough. There's one word. Exactly. Very good. Excellent. Realized. He would say, what must be realized, that I have realized. What must be attained, that I have attained. Therefore, Brahman, I am an enlightened one. Okay, and then, so we could see that the Buddha is, whereas the Brahman is thinking in terms of physical characteristics, the Buddha is speaking in terms of his realization, that realization of the Four Noble Truths that makes him awakened, enlightened. Okay, and now he speaks to the Brahman and he gives him this kind of open invitation. Whatever you wish to know, please ask. Okay, so then when the Brahmin hears that invitation, he thinks, what should I ask about? The good in this life or good in lives to come? I mean, here I am at the age of 68. If I had that choice, I'd ask about I don't have that much time. So he's still almost twice as old as I am. And then he realizes, he thinks, I am already skillful, I already know about the good in this life. And even other people ask me about what's good in this life. Let me ask him about what is good in lives to come. Okay, now this is interesting in that the Brahmin is going to ask the Buddha questions using words that signify what we call the ideal Brahmin within their own system. So he says, I wonder whether this is not, I would call this a staged dialogue, or something composed by the compilers, because it seems a little bit, too artificial to believe that the Brahmin is really asking this. It's almost like a Brahmin setting up the Brahmins as a straw man, or the Brahmin ideal as a straw man to be knocked down by the Buddha through reinterpretation. So he says, how does one become a Brahmin? What is the real meaning of a Brahmin? How does one attain to knowledge? And the word used here is Vedagu. You see it, you'll find it in the notes, so I don't have to write it on the board. Which means, well, maybe it's useful to write it, because then I could explain the parts. You see, the sacred scriptures of the Brahmins were called the Vedas. In Eastern India, in the Buddha's time, they had 3 authoritative Vedas. The Rig Veda, the well, the most important one was the Rig Veda. Okay, and then the task for a Brahmin, the training of the young Brahmin, was to memorize the Yajur Veda. That was the second. The Rig Veda, the Yajur Veda. Anybody would know the third Veda? Okay. So the task for a young Brahmin was to memorize the Vedas and to be able to answer any questions about the meaning of the Vedas. And so when one fully masters the Vedas, then one becomes known as Vedagu. Okay. How has one the triple knowledge? Again, this is referring, for the Brahmin point of view, this refers to the knowledge of the 3 Vedas. How is one called a holy scholar? Again, this is referring to a Brahmin who is, again, fully mastered the scriptures with all of their adjunct auxiliary parts. How does one become, the next set of terms are not really Brahminic terms, but terms from the other tradition of the renunciants, the ascetic renunciants. How does one become an arahant? One who is fully worthy of reverence and veneration. How does one attain completeness or spiritual perfection? How is one called a silent sage? The word is muni. The Buddha himself is called Sakya Muni, the sage of the Sakyan clan. And how is one called a Buddha, an enlightened one? Okay, so now the Buddha is going to answer these questions of the Brahman Brahmayu. And again, he's going to explain in terms of his frame of reference. So he'll be reinterpreting these concepts of the Brahmins as well as the concepts of the wandering ascetics in terms of the Buddhist understanding. Okay, so the Buddha says, who knows about his former lives, who sees the heavens and the states of deprivation. The states of deprivation is referring to the bad realms of rebirth. What are the bad realms of rebirth? The 3 bad realms. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they call them hungry ghosts or afflicted spirits. So collectively, those are called the apaya, the states of misery or the states of deprivation. So who knows about his past lives, who sees the heavens, the states of misery, and has arrived at the destruction or the ending of birth, ending of rebirth. A sage who knows this by direct knowledge, who knows his mind is purified, fully purified, entirely freed from every lust, who has abandoned birth and death, who is complete in the holy life, who has transcended everything in the world. One such as this is called a Buddha. It would seem that the Buddha would have given even a fuller explanation, because probably he would have explained each of the terms here as he does in another sutta that comes earlier in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is Sutta 39. If you go to page 370, towards the bottom, the Buddha says, he's speaking about a monk who has achieved the threefold knowledge. That's the knowledge about his own past lives, the divine eye by which he could see living beings passing away from one realm and taking rebirth elsewhere, and who sees, who has the knowledge of the destruction of defilements. So then he raises the question, the Buddha says, a monk such as this is called a recluse, a samana, a Brahmin, one who has been washed, one who has attained to knowledge, a holy scholar, a noble one, an arahat. Then going further below, he says, how is that monk a Brahmin? And then the answer would be, he has expelled evil, unwholesome states that defile, that bring renewal of existence, that cause trouble, that ripen in suffering, and that lead to future birth, old age, and death. And then basically the same answer is given for one who has attained to knowledge, to the one who is a holy scholar, to the holy one, or the noble one, and to the arahat. Okay, but in the Brahmayu Sutta, the Buddha is answering, you take the first three lines, who knows about his former lives. What is that referring to? Specific reference. Actually, it's explicit as stated here. Because basically it's just the knowledge of one's past lives. Well, it's the knowledge of one's own past lives in samsara. One gets the full formula for that. For example, on page 369, how one recollects one's many past lives, 1 birth, 2 births, 3, 4, 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, in their details and particulars. Okay, then the second line, who sees the heaven and states of deprivation, that's referring specifically to the divine eye through which one could see other realms of existence. And one sees beings passing away and taking rebirth in other realms. And then the third line, who has arrived at the destruction or the ending of birth, that's referring to the third knowledge, the knowledge of the destruction of defilements. Okay, so when the Buddha speaks these verses, then the Brahmin Brahmayu gets up from his seat. He now arranges his upper robe over his shoulder, and then he prostrates himself with his head at the Buddha's feet. And for a Brahmin to do this, it's especially an elderly Brahmin who is respected by everybody, and to do this not in private but in front of a full assembly, it's a gesture, if you could say, of supreme humility and self-effacement. And so, especially because many of the traditional Brahmins had a very hostile attitude towards the samanas, the renunciants. You know, they would disparage them and call them worthless baldy heads. And sometimes they would refuse to give the Buddha and the monks food when they went on alms round. But here this Brahmin Brahmayu, through the Buddha's verses, he realizes that this is a man who's achieved the goal that we ourselves have been striving for without attaining. And so he bows down at the Buddha's feet, and then he kisses the Buddha's feet and caresses the Buddha's feet with his hands, and then he pronounces his own name and says, "I am the Brahman Brahmayu, Master Gotama. I am the Brahman Brahmayu, Master Gotama." Again, that further emphasizes this humility and recognition that the Brahman is giving to the Buddha as being truly an enlightened one. And so everybody in the assembly is then struck with wonder and amazement at how the Brahman is making this display of humility. And I think that the recluse Gotama must be one of great power and great might. So they're still thinking in somewhat materialistic terms, maybe at a more spiritual level, but they think in terms of power and might rather than wisdom and virtue. Okay, so the Buddha then, at this point, he invites the Brahman again to take a seat. And then the Buddha gives him now progressive instruction. You see, when the Brahman bows down to the Buddha and venerates him, the Buddha now realizes that his mind is sort of opened up. You know, he's free from the blockage of conceit, the blockage of resistance, but he's opened himself to the Buddha, and his mind has become settled, confident, trusting. And so the Buddha realizes that he's open to instruction. And so the Buddha starts to give him a progressive discourse. First, he speaks about the benefits of giving, generosity, the benefits of virtue, observing the principles, the precepts of goodness. He talks about the working of karma, the different realms of existence, the heavenly worlds. And then he explains the danger, the degradation, defilement in sensual pleasures, and the blessings of renunciation. And then when he knows that the Brahman's mind is ready, receptive, free from the hindrances, elated and confident, then he expounds the teaching special to the Buddha, or to the Buddhas, that is, the Four Noble Truths of suffering, its origin, its cessation, and the path. And then the text says that just as a clean cloth with all of the marks or all stains and, any kind of dirt, the dust removed, would take dye evenly, so while the Brahman Brahmayu was sitting there arose in him the spotless and immaculate vision of the Dhamma, that insight into the Dhamma, that everything that's subject to arising is subject to cessation. And then, right on that spot while sitting there, it said the Brahman Brahmayu saw the Dhamma, attained the Dhamma, understood the Dhamma, fathomed the Dhamma. He crossed beyond doubt, did away with perplexity or confusion. He gained, I should have changed this word, intrepidity. This means, we say, self-confidence. And he became independent of others. Again, this is a weird expression. Became independent of others in the teacher's dispensation. This is what I call Singlish dispensation. See, when I was in Sri Lanka, some time in the 19th century, some English-educated Sri Lankan Buddhists came up with a word for sasana, dispensation. And sort of when I was in Sri Lanka, I sort of bought into that word. And in editing this, I think I didn't realize that nobody in America, England, Australia, Canada, or English-educated people in any other country in the world is going to know what is meant by dispensation. But the word sasana is simply teaching. So he became independent of others in the teacher's teaching, the teaching of the master, you could say. Richard?
Well, I think the term dispensation is taken after theology. It signifies the difference between time before Jesus and after Jesus. The new dispensation is the time when the gospel is available.
Yeah. Yeah. But it would take...
The old dispensation, making the analogy, the Old Testament, the analogy to Hinduism, the new dispensation,
If anybody in this class would have known that meaning before Richard explained it, raise your hand. Yeah, so, I mean, it's just... I think probably the Sri Lankan person who coined that expression, you know, there was like a whole contingent of Sri Lankans whose families, during the time of the Portuguese conquest, had converted to Catholicism. Then after, when the revival of Buddhism started to take place in the late 19th century, early 20th century, then when Buddhism became respectable again, then they gave up Catholicism and came back to Buddhism. Yeah.
the term comes from the idea of dispensation of grace.
Yeah.
The idea was that before Jesus, nobody could be saved.
Yeah.
And then God dispensed his grace.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we're applying the same term.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Buddha makes light and enlightenment available.
Yeah.
So it's a new dispensation.
Yeah. Yeah. But the Pali word is sasana, which, I mean, literally it's a little more elevated than teaching in English. It's a little different from Dhamma, in that the way I would distinguish, Dhamma is, you could say, the truth of what is being taught, whereas sasana is the actual conveying of the instruction. But dispensation, unless one is sort of grounded in this Christian theology, one is unlikely to know the meaning.
The debate went on for a long time because there were a lot, you see, particularly when Aquinas adopted Aristotle,
Yeah.
and you had the Neoplatonists adopting Plato, there were a lot of people saying, well, look, here are these noble Greeks,
Yeah.
and certainly they deserve to be saved, but salvation wasn't available to them. Before Jesus, how unfair that is. So this was a debate that went
Yeah.
on for a long time.
Yeah.
Through medieval life, and also it went on particularly surrounding Calvin, who had predestination.
Yeah.
And so predestination, the issue was, okay, God's predetermining whether or not you could be saved, and for some reason, no one was worthy of being saved before the advent of Jesus. So that had to be explained too.
Yeah.
So it was a major theological debate.
Didn't Dante even have to assign poor Aristotle to Hades? I don't remember.
Aristotle, yeah, I think he's in a section of Hades where he isn't feeling any pain. He's in limbo, I think.
A limbo, that's it, yeah.
Along with the unbaptized infants.
Okay, so this is dispensation. So all of this long sentence here is indicating that, what is being indicated here by this expression? Close, very close. It's not the actual full enlightenment yet. Not becoming an arhat, no. Excuse me? Well, he remains a Brahmin in terms of his class position. I heard here, and you said what? That's not yet explicit. What's not yet explicit is the level that he's attained. But he's attained sort of definite, let's say he's entered the definite path leading to full liberation. At least stream entry. It doesn't specify exactly what stage he's reached yet. But when you see this formula, you know that the person who's reached it is at least a stream enterer, which means that one has entered the stream to full enlightenment, but not yet reached the final goal. And so he's sort of what marks entering the stream is seeing the Dhamma, which means seeing the Four Noble Truths, understanding it, fathoming it. With that, one goes beyond doubt because one's seen the truth, so you don't have any more doubt about it. And then doing away with perplexity is the same, basically it's the same thing. Gaining self-confidence, again, it means that one's mastered the truth of the teaching. And so one becomes independent of others, even independent of the Buddha. He doesn't have to listen to the Buddha's instruction anymore because he has the truth within himself. He just has to reach the final goal. He just has to cultivate that insight into the truth. Okay, so then the Brahmin expresses his joy, his appreciation of the Dhamma, and then he goes for refuge to the Buddha, and then he invites the Buddha together with the community of monks to receive the next day's meal from him. Okay, so the Buddha consents with silence, and then the Brahmin parts. He pays homage to the Buddha, and then he departs. Then, early the next morning, the Brahmin will have various kinds of food prepared. You know, the Brahmin, he would be in charge of like a large household. So at the age of 120, he's not doing the cooking himself, but he'll have probably servants and his students who will do the cooking. And then when the meal is all ready, he announces the time to the Buddha. And then the Buddha, together with all of the monks, go to the Brahmin's residence. They sit down, they take their meal. And it said that for a week, with his own hands, the Brahmin Brahmayu served and satisfied the community of monks, headed by the Buddha, with various kinds of good food. And of course, after each meal, the Buddha will give the discourse to the Brahmin and all of his students and household. And so it's possible that as the Brahmin was listening to the Buddha explain more of the Dhamma, that he was reaching still higher stages of realization. Okay, then at the end of that week, then the Buddha decides to set out further on his wandering, and so he leaves. Then shortly afterwards, the Brahmin Brahmayu passes away. And then probably messengers came to the Buddha to report that his new disciple, the Brahmin Brahmayu, had passed away. So the monks hear this, and they go to the Buddha and report it to the Buddha. And then they ask, they say, "Venerable Sir, the Brahman Brahmayu has died, what is his destination? What is his future course? Then, excuse me, then the Buddha says, the Brahman Brahmayu was wise. He entered into the way of the Dhamma, and he did not trouble me in the interpretation of the Dhamma.